A little boy pointed to a decaying chicken coop and softly said, "This is my home." Everyone laughed, thinking he was just pretending. Until one day, a millionaire quietly came, opened the creaky door of the coop, and uncovered a truth so shocking it shook the entire legal system. Because that child, he didn't need anyone's pity. He just needed someone brave enough to believe in him. If someone calls a place with a roof, brick walls and windows a home, then for James Whitman, 10 years old, home was nothing more than a chicken coop. It used to hold broiler chickens and was later patched up with rotting wooden planks. The roof leaked, the floor was freezing. No windows, no power outlets. No one called him son. To everyone else, it was just an abandoned corner behind the backyard. But to James, it was the only place he could sleep without being hit. Not a home, just shelter. Dusk had fallen, and a cold drizzle blurred the window frame of a decaying wooden house in the suburbs. Inside the smoke-stained kitchen, thick with the stench of stale beer, cigarettes, and rotting food, James stood trembling beside the table, his small hands gripping the edge of his shirt. A loud crash shattered the air. The beer mug slipped from James's hands, smashing on the tiled floor. Foam spread in a cloudy streak beneath his feet. A feral roar erupted. "What the hell did you just do? Do you have any idea how much that beer cost, you worthless trash?" Roy Geller, a beer-bellied man with tattooed arms and eyes bloodshot with booze, charged forward. He grabbed James by the collar and yanked him as if tearing a ragged sack. "You just let him wreck the place," he shouted at Hilary Vaughan. The woman, James's biological mother, didn't even glance at her son. She slouched on a torn leather chair, lazily swirling a liquor bottle, like muscle memory, her voice colder than winter wind. "I told you, he's not my child." Those words slashed through James's fragile soul like a blade, but he didn't cry. He stayed silent. His tears didn't fall. They sank inward, deep into his heart. Roy raised a hand to strike, but James dodged. His eyes didn't plead. They just held a quiet kind of desperation. "Get out! Go sleep under the damn streetlights, you piece of garbage," Roy spat. James stepped out into the rain, clutching a torn backpack, his small feet splashing through muddy puddles. He didn't know where he was going, only that he had to leave. Leave the fists. Leave the woman who once called herself his mother. He found shelter beneath the stairs of an old apartment building. It was damp, dark, smelled like mold. But at least no one hit him there. He placed his bag down and pulled out a damp book, 100 Rights Every Child Deserves, a tattered library hand-me-down. That book was all James had. That, and a quiet dream that one day he'd be like other kids. At that moment, a car pulled up near the building. Nathaniel Grayson, a successful real estate mogul, founder of an empire, had just wrapped up a long day. He stepped out of the car, reaching for his phone to call his driver, when he spotted James, soaked, shivering, clutching a book. "What are you doing out here in the rain?" Nathaniel asked gently. James flinched, backing away like a stray animal used to being kicked. "I'm not asking for money." "I didn't think you were," Nathaniel replied. "I just see a boy who's cold and probably hungry." Without another word, Nathaniel returned to his car. He came back with a brand new backpack, some pastries, and a business card. He placed them in front of James. "If you ever need help, just text me one word. Help. I'll come." James didn't say anything, but he held on to that business card like it was a lifeline. The next morning, Hilary spotted the new backpack. "Where'd you get this? You steal it?" James said nothing. Roy grabbed the bag and tore it open. Finding nothing worth pawning, he flew into a rage. "Who are you trying to fool, huh? Think you can trick me?" They dragged James into the backyard, shoved him into the chicken coop. The door slammed shut. Locked. Inside, the stench was suffocating. Wind howled through cracks in the wood. James curled up and pulled out a notebook. Inside were diary entries, detailed accounts of every beating, every curse, every hopeless night. With his fingernail, he scratched a message into the rotting wall. "If you read this, please don't stay silent." In that suffocating darkness, James didn't sleep. He waited for a hand to pull him from hell, or at the very least, for the first ray of light, to pierce the coop he called home. Meanwhile, across the city, a man also couldn't sleep. In a sleek, modern high-rise, warm but hollow, Nathaniel Grayson sat by the window. He looked out over the glittering skyline. Lights, like confetti, scattered across the horizon. But not a single one could warm the emptiness in his chest. He thought of that boy, James. The wet hair, the torn shirt, the eyes cast down, but not broken. A boy who didn't cry. Not because it didn't hurt, but because no one was left to cry with. And Nathaniel wondered, where is he now? The thought sliced slowly, but deeply. He stood up, didn't turn on the lights, let the city glow spill through the glass onto a framed photo on the wall. His son, a boy who was once 10, who once called him Dad, with a voice like sunlight. Nathaniel stepped closer, gently placed a hand on the photo. His eyes clouded, heavy with tears that hadn't fallen yet. "If you were still here, you wouldn't let that boy sleep on the street, would you?" A child, locked in a chicken coop. Nathaniel Grayson had no idea. To him, that rainy night had seemed like just a fleeting encounter. But as he drove through the quiet streets later that evening, the image of that boy, thin, soaked to the bone, clutching a torn backpack, shivering from the cold, but still refusing to bow his head, haunted him. James. That name etched itself into Nathaniel's mind like a silent, deep wound. Touching the part of his heart he thought had frozen over ever since his own son passed away. When Nathaniel returned to his luxurious but empty high-rise apartment, he didn't turn the lights on right away. He stood in the dark for a long time, watching the city's glow reflect off a photo hanging on the wall. His son, with bright eyes and a radiant smile. He reached out and touched an old toy car on the shelf. A thin layer of dust coated the tiny wheels. The memories came flooding back. His son's laughter in the backyard, the sound of Dad ringing through the air, a voice he hadn't heard in years. And then, James. Another boy, about the same age, but no backyard, no laughter, no toy cars, only bruises and silence. "I should have done something sooner," Nathaniel whispered, his voice hoarse, like he was speaking to a soul long gone. Winter winds sliced through the bare branches of the trees, delivering sharp, stinging cold to the skin. In the corner of a small park beside the old apartment complex, an ancient tree with gnarled roots stretched above the ground, like aged hands trying to hold on to fading memories. That's where James sat, silent and huddled. His old coat was worn thin, his eyes downcast as always, but beside him sat a new backpack and a small paper bag filled with pastries. He didn't eat right away. He was waiting. Familiar footsteps pressed against the damp ground. Nathaniel Grayson, the man who had once knelt in the rain, had come back. He didn't speak at first. His leather shoes came to a stop at the base of the tree. His long coat billowed slightly in the breeze, his hair a bit tousled, and once again his eyes settled on James. "You came earlier than yesterday," Nathaniel said, his voice deep and calm. Not a trace of pity in it, only a gentle steadiness. James gave a small nod. No smile, no greeting. But in that silence, there was acceptance. He pulled a worn book from his bag, the Child Protection Laws. The cover was creased, The corners folded like they'd been turned over and over. "I'm on Article 14, James murmured, voice just loud enough to be heard above the wind. "Every child has the right to live in a violence-free environment." Nathaniel turned his head toward him, his brows furrowed. A crease formed at the corner of his mouth. His eyes couldn't hide what he felt: bitterness, guilt, and sorrow. A man who had lost his child. Now listening to another one try to explain cruelty using the language of the law. He swallowed hard, steadying his voice. "Why are you reading that? At your age, you should be drawing, playing, living freely, not reading this kind of thing." James didn't answer. He just shrugged, a small, weary shrug that hurt more than words. There were no tears in his eyes, but something thick and heavy lingered there, like a wall no one had ever tried to climb. Nathaniel stayed silent. He realized something that moment. When a child matures too early, it's not something to praise. It's an unspoken accusation against the adults around them. He looked around the park. Every bench, every tree stood like silent witnesses. A sense of unease stirred in his chest. A quiet alarm, but one that rang true. In the days that followed, a new habit formed in that small park. An older man and a skinny boy sat together beneath the ancient tree. No noise, no endless questions, just sitting, letting their presence speak what hadn't yet been said. James began to open up, bit by bit. He told stories of scavenging recyclables, of dinners that were nothing but dry bread crusts, of sneaking into the library to study by dim hallway lights. "All I want is a bed with a warm light above it," James once said when Nathaniel asked him what he wished for most. Nathaniel didn't answer right away, but his hands, resting on his lap, clenched tightly. Inside him rose a flood of emotions: anger at the world, or maybe at himself for coming too late. One chilly afternoon, wind threading through bare branches, James carefully dug a small hole beneath the tree. His tiny, calloused hands trembled slightly as he worked. "What are you doing?" Nathaniel asked, kneeling beside him, voice low like wind brushing dry leaves. James didn't respond right away. He pulled out a small, worn wooden box, placed it in the hole, then gently covered it with dry leaves. "If one day you don't see me here anymore, look under this tree," James said, his eyes fixed on the ground. Nathaniel held his breath. The fear inside him was no longer vague. It had taken shape. It stabbed like a needle under the skin. "What's in there?" he asked. "Proof. A journal. And something that shows I wasn't making it up." Nathaniel slowly knelt, placed a hand on James's shoulder. For the first time, his eyes showed something clear and solid. Resolve. "You won't need to use that box," he said. "I promise." James stayed quiet for a few seconds, then nodded. A small, fragile nod, like someone placing their trust on another's shoulders for the very first time. That evening, as the streetlights flickered on, James stood up. He turned back and whispered, "Thank you for just sitting with me." Nathaniel didn't answer, but he understood. Sometimes, just sitting quietly with a wounded child, without pressing, without pity, without demand, is the strongest kind of healing. The wind rustled through the tree, scattering a few leaves to the ground, like whispers of something about to begin. And in a place that once seemed meaningless, a rundown park, a bare, old tree, something sacred was planted. Trust. James, the boy once locked in a chicken coop, had begun to open his heart, and Nathaniel, the father with no blood ties, had stepped in, gently but firmly. They didn't know it yet, but from that moment on, their fates were entwined, and that old tree, once just shelter, would become the silent witness to a journey of justice and love. A gloomy morning. The streets were damp, after a light drizzle. While most children were being walked to school by their parents, laughing under colourful raincoats, James stood curled up in front of the social welfare office. The 10-year-old boy had been shoved there by his mother and her boyfriend Roy. His hair was faded, his shirt torn at the shoulder, and his face wore a rehearsed expression of pitiful misery, like an actor who knew his role too well. Hillary gripped his arm tightly, her face like stone, and hissed through clenched teeth. "You remember what I told you. The second you speak, you cry. Cry like you lost your mum and dad. Got it? If you don't bring back money, I'll smash your face in when we get home. You hear me? You useless little—" Roy stepped closer, slapped James hard on the shoulder, making him stagger, then leaned in with his booze-soaked breath. "Act it out real good, or you're sleeping with the chickens again. This time, I'll lock it shut. No more screaming. I'm tired of your damn voice." Inside the welfare office waiting room, Hillary sat across from a caseworker, her voice syrupy, sweet, her eyes playing the part of a concerned mother. "My boy, he's so frail. Been sick since he was little. I work all day and still can't afford his meds. Please, ma'am, sir. We just need a little help." James sat quietly behind her. He didn't speak. He didn't look up. He just bowed his head, clutching tightly onto a small notebook hidden beneath his coat. Inside that notebook were meticulous notes, quotes, behaviors, times, and places. Like a tiny detective, James was quietly building a case for the trial of his own life. A young social worker, visibly unsettled, noticed the bruise peeking from under James's sleeve. She leaned in gently and asked, "Did you fall?" James pressed his lips shut. He wasn't silent because he didn't know what to say. He'd simply learned that speaking only brought more pain. Hillary quickly jumped in with a dry laugh. "Oh, he's such a handful. Climbed a tree and fell. Boys, you know, always getting into scrapes." But James's eyes told a different story. One quick glance, sad, hollow, and almost numb, was enough to make the social worker's breath hitch. She sat up straighter and scribbled extra notes into the file, a growing sense of unease weighing down her chest. After the meeting, 2 young welfare staff spoke in the hallway. "Something's off," one said. "That boy, it's not just poverty. He looks exploited." The other nodded. "I felt that too. But there's no evidence. They play their roles well. Maybe we should escalate it." At that same time, a few blocks away, a man in a dark coat stood in front of the public library. Nathaniel Grayson. He was speaking with Matilda, the elderly librarian. "That boy James, does he still come here every week?" Nathaniel asked, his voice slow and heavy. "Yes," she replied. "But lately he's changed. Not like the other kids. He reads law books, child protection rights, and writes down tons of notes. I used to think he was just smart. Now I think he's crying out for help." Nathaniel nodded. He didn't say that since that rainy night they met, he'd quietly started gathering every piece of information he could about James, not out of curiosity, but from a deep, instinctive pull. Save this child before it's too late. Back home, Roy forced James to follow him to collect recyclables. James dragged a heavy sack over his shoulder. His legs were scraped, his shoulders bruised. Hillary walked ahead, scanning trash bins for salvageable goods. "Move it," she snapped. "You always look like you've got something wrong in the head. Want dinner or not?" Roy found an empty beer can and threw it at James's head. "See this? Other kids are in school. You, useless waste. You should have died at birth, would have saved food." People passed by. Some glanced, but none stopped. They moved past him like wind. And James, 10 years old, frail, dragging a sack heavier than himself, became just another blur in the indifferent crowd. As daylight faded, the evening breeze swept through the streets, carrying the smell of street food. But James's stomach was still empty. He watched a group of students walk past in their crisp white uniforms, like ghosts from a world he dreamed of, but never touched. James began gathering the truth. He hid recording devices in hardcover library books. He used a discarded phone he'd found in a junkyard, charging it bit by bit, recording the yelling, Roy's threats, Hillary's insults, even his own muffled sobs. Every evening, he returned to the library. Matilda, once thinking James was just a book-loving child, began noticing the hardened look in his eyes, a look no 10-year-old should carry, cold, wary, and never begging. James took long detours, circling blocks to avoid Roy's suspicions. He wasn't allowed to visit the library. He wasn't allowed to take anything from the house. But today, he took a risk, for a dream that needed a place to hide. One evening, James quietly handed Matilda a book, A History of Children's Rights. He didn't say much, just placed it gently into her hands and whispered, "Keep this safe. There's something important inside, for someone you trust." Inside was a USB drive, a journal, the truth. That night, in the damp chicken coop, James wrote in his notebook again, "Today, Roy hit me with a beer bottle. Mum watched. I placed a recorder under the table. Matilda has a copy. If something happens to me, they'll know." He returned to the rotting wooden wall and carved again the words he once had. "If you find this, please don't stay silent." That boy, frail, small, was fighting like a warrior. Not with fists, but with words, with evidence, with truth. On the surface, Roy and Hillary kept playing their roles as the struggling poor. But they didn't know. The script was unraveling. And the child they thought easiest to control was the one dismantling their lies. Elsewhere, beneath the old tree where two souls often met, always at night, when the city dimmed and quieted, Nathaniel continued to wait. Some nights he brought a new book. Some nights he just sat, staring into the dark as if listening to something far away. Days passed, but James didn't return. Nathaniel stood there, long after the sky turned slate grey. He placed a familiar book on the bench, Children's Rights, the one James liked. A quiet promise. He didn't know the details, but he knew something was terribly wrong. Maybe it was close now. Maybe the mask was about to crack, and the truth would finally be called by its rightful name. What James didn't know yet was this. There were adults beginning to kneel, not in pity, but to finally listen. That night, cold wind pierced through the coop's wooden walls. James lay curled in the dark, his eyes wide open. He no longer cried. Tears had long run dry, but inside him brewed a storm, not of fear, but of will. The letter hidden in the book he gave Matilda had no reply. Yet. James didn't know if this time the adults would believe him, but he kept recording, he kept writing, and most of all, he kept waiting. The next morning was overcast. James was yanked from sleep early, hurriedly shoved into an ill-fitting old shirt, and pushed into the back seat of a car. "Act properly," Hillary hissed through clenched teeth. "It's a church-run summer camp, meals and lessons, but if you say one wrong word, you know what happens." James didn't ask why his mother suddenly wanted him to go. He didn't expect much from the trip. But deep down, he hoped. Just a little. Hope that maybe, somewhere out there, someone would listen without needing him to beg. That maybe, this time, would be different. The summer camp, organized by a local church, was tucked away from the city, hidden beyond a stretch of green trees where cicadas and birds blended into the laughter of children. Canvas tents lined the field, drenched in sunlight and joy. But when James stepped out of the car, he simply stood still. 10 years old, he looked like a shadow among bright colors. He didn't run. He didn't smile. He stepped back toward a wooden bench beneath a tree, watching everything with guarded eyes. Pastor Harold Green, the camp's director, walked slowly over, a man in his late 50s with graying hair, but a smile warm as morning sun. He didn't speak right away, just sat beside James in silence. "What's your name?" he asked gently after a few minutes. "James." The boy's voice was barely audible, hoarse, like every sound inside him had long been locked away. "Can you read?" James nodded. "Later, when everyone gathers, would you like to read something you like?" James froze for a moment. He had never stood in front of a group, never been asked what he liked. That night, under the glow of campfire lanterns, children lined up to share their dreams and funny stories. James stepped up to the small stage, his legs trembling slightly. Pastor Harold gave him a soft nod of encouragement. James held a shaky sheet of paper, but then he looked up and spoke. "I don't have a big dream. I just want a place to sleep where the door isn't locked, a light that stays on at night, and someone to ask me how my day was." A silence fell, so deep it swallowed the sound of insects in the woods. In the distance, a man stood quietly. Nathaniel. He had arranged with Pastor Harold to attend the program anonymously. As James spoke, Nathaniel closed his eyes. A weight pressed in his chest. His own son had once said those same words, before illness took him away. Pastor Harold didn't move. Those words, simple, honest, and raw, landed like a punch to the heart. The whole space seemed to hold its breath. Then someone clapped, then another. Then the entire camp rose to their feet, not out of pity, but out of respect for a boy who had dared to speak. Matilda, the librarian, was there that night too. She placed a hand over her chest, feeling her heart tighten. And in that moment, she saw something in James's eyes. Not just sadness, but strength. A beginning. Pastor Harold didn't just clap. He turned, walked straight to his office, pulled out a blank sheet of paper, and wrote a letter that same night to Child Protective Services, attaching a recording of James's speech. He had seen many abandoned children in his time. But James was more than hurt. He was a spark, flaring in a dark room. Not large, but bright enough to say, "Life is still here. Hope is still here." That night, Pastor Harold found Nathaniel and said, "You know that boy better than I thought." Nathaniel replied, "Because I once lost a boy just like him. This time, I won't lose again." That same evening, Nathaniel quietly texted Matilda, "Send me everything. The recordings, the journal pages, the exact address. It's time someone did what an adult is supposed to do, the right way." When James got home, Roy slapped him across the face at the front door. "What the hell were you pulling back there?" Hillary yanked the backpack off James's shoulders, rummaging through every pocket. "Nothing," she growled. "But from now on, you're not going anywhere unless I come with you. Got it?" James only nodded. But that night, in the dark of the chicken coop, he carefully opened the old wristwatch he'd been given at camp. Inside the backplate was a hidden memory card, holding a copy of his speech, along with Pastor Harold's emotional response. James had started fighting back, with his mind. One evening, he spotted his mother sitting at the table, scribbling through financial aid forms. James quietly observed and noticed discrepancies, names, account numbers. Hillary was forging documents. He casually dropped his notebook to the floor, bent down, just as the old phone in his pocket began recording. The next day, Roy tore through the house. "Someone snitched. I know it. Someone's been listening." He suspected James. But James had already moved the evidence. A recording device hidden inside a pencil case. A USB drive sealed beneath the lid of an empty soda can. He was learning misdirection, like a little soldier. Roy barked, "You been spying on us, huh? Who'd you tell?" James shrugged. That quiet defiance drove Roy mad. But James didn't cry. And that silence was what began to make the adults fear him. That night, James faked sleep. His jacket bulged slightly, hiding another recorder. In the kitchen, Roy and Hillary argued over how to split the newest welfare check. Every insult, every word, every curse, recorded. At the library, Matilda quietly created a new internal record. Children at risk of abuse. She photographed James's journal entries, downloaded USB contents, and sent them to an encrypted email account belonging to Nathaniel Grayson, who now visited the library nightly, searching for updates on James. Nathaniel sat in his car, listening to the recording of James's speech at camp. The applause, the quiet sobs, and that trembling yet firm voice. "I won't be silent anymore." Nathaniel's eyes darkened. His grip tightened on the steering wheel. A flash of lightning lit up the sky beyond the windshield. It was time, not to act as a millionaire, but as the one person James still had hope in. Back in the coop, James carved another line into the decaying wood. "They can lock the door, but they can't lock my will." The grown-ups' performance was unraveling, and James's story, it was only just beginning. After summer camp, James thought he might finally breathe again. Just a few days of peace, but only days after returning, everything got worse. Much worse. Roy, the man James had never once called Dad, became something else entirely. He didn't scream anymore. He acted. He didn't strike with belts like before. He punched, hard, directer. Every time he got high or angry over reasons no one could name, he unleashed it all on James's small body. The boy was slammed into walls. His nose bled. Still, not a single cry. Hillary, the woman who should have been a mother, just stood nearby, arms crossed, her voice like iron. "You live in my house. That means I own you." James was dragged back to the chicken coop. The metal door clanged shut. The rusty lock was tightened with a wire loop. Inside, a few torn sacks, the stench of chicken droppings and urine thick enough to choke the air. He sat in the dark corner, back pressed to rotting wood, silently watching a hen nesting nearby. The bird had just laid eggs, tucking her head over her chicks, gently pecking at scattered grains. James smiled, just barely, a smile so small it hurt the heart. Even a chicken protects its young. What did his mother see him as? Something to discard? He bent down, dug his fingernail into the wood, and carved, "If you find this, please don't stay silent." It rained. Heavy drops drummed on the tin roof, echoing like a slow, mournful beat on a weary soul. James clutched his worn-out jacket and closed his eyes. But he didn't sleep. He was waiting, not to be rescued, but for something from the outside world, light, a voice, or even just a spark of hope. Across the yard, Mrs. Holloway, the landlady, heard something strange in the night. At first, she thought she imagined it, the thuds, soft cries. Then the sound of a lock slamming shut. She pressed her ear to the wall, hesitant. Then went back to bed in silence. The next morning, she brewed tea, went to the market. But something gnawed at her. At the vegetable stall, she spoke quietly to her neighbors. "I heard something last night, from Hillary's place. Sounded like a child being hurt. But maybe I misheard. My ears aren't what they used to be." Another woman waved her off. "That boy's always quiet. Probably did something wrong again. Everyone disciplines their kids." Mrs. Holloway pressed her lips together. She knew something was wrong. She could feel it, in the way James had once looked at her through the door crack. A silent plea, a glance that begged without words. That evening, she went straight to the police station. She told them everything, but she had no proof, no photos of bruises, no witnesses. The officer on duty sighed. "We need evidence, ma'am. Just sounds aren't enough." She left, heart sinking. That night, she didn't sleep. She stood quietly behind her curtain, eyes on the house across the yard. The coop glowed dimly with a single yellowed bulb. No sound. But in her chest, an icy wind blew, as if someone was dying quietly inside. In the coop, James pulled a small pen, a USB stick, and his old notebook from his pocket. He wrote, "I don't know if I'll be alive tomorrow, but if someone reads this, please believe me. And don't stay silent, like they did." He folded the notebook, hid it deep in a wooden crack only he knew about. His hands trembled, but his eyes shone. He wasn't begging, wasn't crying, wasn't giving in. He was waiting, for one thing only, for the truth to be heard. Even if it came from a chicken coop, from behind hay bales, or from silent screams, James believed, someone would come. And out there, someone was coming. Nathaniel Grayson, the man James had met only a few times under the old tree at night, now sat in his car, quietly reviewing the documents Matilda had sent. Photos of James, medical notes, audio from the summer camp, a copy of the message carved on the coop wall. Nathaniel looked outside. It was still raining. But his mind was clear now. It was time to stop standing on the sidelines. Time to open a door. Inside him burned a quiet fury. The fury of powerlessness, of once being too late to save his own son. This time, he wouldn't be. He turned on the car light and flipped to the last page, a photo of James at summer camp, speaking on stage. Eyes lit, shoulders thin but upright. That boy had stood up. Now it was time for the adults to act. He picked up his phone and texted Matilda. "I need more files, the raw audio, and the exact address of where he lives." Now Nathaniel turns toward you, the one listening to this story. Maybe you're hearing it in your car, on your lunch break, lying in bed. Wherever you are, ask yourself, have you ever known a child like James? Don't stay silent. Leave a comment. Speak up. Because maybe what you say could be the key that opens a door for someone else out there. We'll keep following Nathaniel on his quiet but determined journey to bring light to where James still waits. Before the sun had fully risen, a city police patrol car quietly pulled up in front of the rundown house at the end of the alley. Inside the vehicle, Detective Charles Morton and two officers stared at the front door, the very place Nathaniel had identified as where James was being held. Inside, Roy was high, pacing with a knife in hand. James was tied to a chair with electrical cords, a moldy cloth stuffed into his mouth. His body trembled, bruises scattered across his thin frame. His face was swollen, lips bloodied. But his eyes, dark and sunken, weren't afraid anymore. They were numb, as though pain had long since surpassed its limit. Roy growled, stepping closer. "You think you can record me? Set me up. I'll show you what betrayal feels like, you little—" Suddenly the door burst open. "Police!" Charles shouted. Roy spun around, but before he could react, he was slammed to the floor. The knife clattered out of his hand. Hillary ran from the other room, screaming hysterically, "You've got the wrong house! He's my son! I have rights! I gave birth to him!" Officers restrained her. She flailed, but her eyes, they no longer resembled those of a mother. They were the eyes of someone whose mask had just been torn away. Police searched the house quickly. One officer called from the back, "Signs of captivity," Electrical cords, blood stains, another knife in the kitchen drawer. James was untied. He staggered to his feet, the cloth still leaving marks around his mouth. His forehead was swollen, his arms scratched. He looked around, stunned, unsure if he was really free. Charles knelt beside him, placed a steady hand on his shoulder. "James, you're safe now." 3 weeks later, the courtroom was packed. Media was barred, but inside, the air was heavy. James sat beside Nathaniel in a neatly pressed grey suit. His eyes were sharp, steady, not just to recount his story, but to reclaim justice. Across the room, Roy and Hilary sat at the defendant's table. Roy scowled, but his gaze was vacant. Hilary trembled, her face pale and lifeless. They didn't speak, because they didn't have to. Everything had already been recorded. James's audio files, his journal, Mrs. Holloway's testimony, Matilda the librarian's statement, and Pastor Harold Green's detailed account. The officers laid out the facts. Roy had a prior record of violent assault. Weapons, restraints, and signs of abuse were found in the home. James had been repeatedly locked in a chicken coop, beaten, and starved. Hilary exploited James for illegal welfare claims, forged medical documents, and was complicit in his abuse and unlawful imprisonment. The courtroom fell silent. James was called to the stand. He walked forward without looking at his parents, holding his statement tightly. He spoke, slow and steady. "I don't hate my mother. But I don't want to spend another day being beaten, locked up, or called a burden. I don't need much. I just want to live like a normal kid. I just want to live without getting hurt." He paused, his eyes lifted, glistening, but no tears fell. "I once wrote something inside the chicken coop where I was locked up. If you find this, please don't stay silent. Today, I want to say thank you, because you didn't stay silent." Witnesses came forward one by one. Mrs. Holloway, once hesitant, now wept as she described the sounds she'd heard through the walls. Matilda clutched the book James had hidden the USB in, her voice cracking. "No one noticed the boy who came to the library every night. But I did. That look in his eyes. It didn't ask for anything. It only waited." Pastor Harold recounted James's summer camp speech. The recording played, and the entire courtroom held its breath. Finally, Nathaniel stood. He wore a dark blue suit, elegant but simple. In his hand, a thick file. It contained documentation of assets, audited tax records, psychological evaluations proving a healthy living environment, and enrollment confirmations in post-trauma therapy programs for James, led by top specialists. "Your Honor," he began, his voice deep, calm, resolute. "I didn't give life to James, but I am ready to be his father. I cannot replace the years he lost, but I promise I will help him rebuild what comes next." He glanced at James, his eyes misty but unwavering. "I currently serve as the CEO of Grayson & Partners, a global financial investment firm headquartered in New York. My net worth is estimated at $340 million. I've established the James Whitman Trust Fund to ensure his right to lifelong education and protection, regardless of my future circumstances. I've submitted all documentation regarding living conditions, support teams, and mental health specialists. I believe that when the court decides guardianship, it should not only consider blood, it should consider the heart. And my heart chose James the moment I saw him huddled under the stairs in the rain." James looked up at him with eyes full of trust. For the first time during the trial, he smiled. The judge nodded. His voice rang out, "After reviewing the evidence, witness statements, and living arrangements, the court hereby grants full legal guardianship to Mr. Nathaniel Grayson." The room exhaled. Nathaniel turned to James. He didn't speak. He simply opened his arms. James stood still for a second, then ran into them. His small shoulders shook. His head rested on Nathaniel's chest. For the first time in his life, he felt peace without conditions. He looked up. Tears shimmered in his eyes, but they weren't tears of pain. They were tears of belonging. And then he whispered, soft, but enough to move everyone. "Dad, we have a home now." Nathaniel nodded, arms tightening around him, as if to make up for all the years lost. Roy was sentenced to 25 years in prison for child abuse, use of deadly weapons, unlawful imprisonment, and welfare fraud. Hillary received 18 years for complicity, fraud, and child endangerment. As Roy was escorted out, he screamed, "You ungrateful brat! I raised you all these years." Hillary said nothing. She simply lowered her head, avoiding James's gaze. A gaze no longer filled with hatred, just release. The courtroom doors closed. One chapter ended, another began, with two quiet, powerful words: freedom and family. As the courtroom doors closed behind him, James stood quietly in the hallway, his legs trembling, but there was no fear in his eyes. No ropes, no more Roy shouting, no more cold, empty stares from a mother who once left him to sleep in a chicken coop. Nathaniel approached and knelt down on one knee in front of him. "You did so well," he said, voice low and shaking with emotion. "From today on, you're not alone anymore." James looked at him, eyes red but dry. What he felt was something unfamiliar. Safety. "I don't know how to live without being afraid," James whispered. Nathaniel gently held his small hand. "Then we'll learn together. One step at a time. You and me." James nodded. He didn't smile. But inside, something shifted. A soft heartbeat in a place once filled with darkness. After the trial, James's story spread across news outlets nationwide. The image of the words carved into rotting wood with a fingernail. "If you find this, please, don't stay silent," moved millions to tears. News anchors condemned the mother and her partner for their cruelty. But hearts also swelled at the sight of Nathaniel Grayson, wealthy, once broken, standing before the press, declaring, "I won't just provide for James financially. I'll give him the love he should have had from the beginning. If he'll let me, I'll be not just a father, but also the mother he never had." The adoption process moved swiftly. Nathaniel's legal documents were airtight. A respected businessman with a clean record, verified assets, and a public history of charitable work, he had already proven, both in testimony and through action, that he was worthy of guardianship. The judge, familiar with Nathaniel's reputation and character, didn't hesitate to approve the petition. James moved into a penthouse apartment with Nathaniel, overlooking the park where they had first met. Despite his wealth, Nathaniel lived modestly. The home was warm and refined. Oak floors, soft beige walls, and ambient golden lighting that wrapped each room in calm. The living room held a tall bookshelf, a few abstract paintings, and one framed photo of Nathaniel, James, a brown-haired woman, and a smiling boy, his late wife and son. On his first night there, James stared at the photo for a long time. He didn't ask questions. He simply placed his hand gently on the frame and whispered, "I know. They'll always have a special place in your heart. I won't replace them, but I hope I can be a small part of this family too." Nathaniel pulled him into a hug. No promises needed. Just a quiet embrace, enough to warm two once broken souls. James's room wasn't large, but it held every piece of his unfinished dream. A sturdy wooden bed, a warm yellow nightlight, a desk facing the window, and a small bookshelf that Nathaniel built with his own hands. The walls were painted pale blue, James's choice when asked for the first time, "What do you want your room to look like?" At night, there were no more jolts awake. No need to hide USBs. No more banging doors or voices through gritted teeth. Only the soft click of a lamp, and Nathaniel's gentle voice before closing the door. "Good night, son." At his new school, James ran into Tommy Ricks, a boy who used to tease him for his torn clothes and worn-out shoes. At first, Tommy avoided him, but after hearing the full story, he approached with hesitation. I'm sorry. I didn't know. If I had, I wouldn't have done any of it." James was silent for a moment, then said quietly, "I'm not mad. Just don't do that to anyone else." From that day on, Tommy became a loyal friend. During the citywide student competition, James, guided by Tommy, presented a speech titled, "I Once Lived in a Chicken Coop." The audience and the judging panel were visibly moved, not just by his story, but by his delivery. No bitterness, no anger, only rebirth. At the same library where James once hid his journal, a small ceremony was held honoring students who overcame adversity. James was invited to speak. Standing at the microphone, he took a deep breath and looked at the audience. "I used to live in a chicken coop. Now, I have a light, a bed, and someone who calls me son. I'm not telling this to get pity. I'm telling it because maybe somewhere out there, another child is scratching something into a wall no one sees. And I want to say to them, and to all the adults, please, don't stay silent." The entire room rose in applause. Matilda, the elderly librarian, wiped away tears. Detective Charles Morton, now a close friend to both father and son, stood quietly in the back, smiling. That night, James returned to his small, peaceful room. He turned on his nightlight. The gentle glow washed over the ceiling, painting the space with the peace he once only dreamed of. He climbed into bed, pulled up the blanket, and glanced at the doorway where Nathaniel stood. "Dad, we have a home now." Nathaniel nodded, eyes glistening, but smiling wide. "And you'll never have to leave it again." James closed his eyes. For the first time in his life, he slept deeply. Seasons changed. The old tree still stood, but beneath its branches, there was no longer a boy curled in fear, only the steady presence of someone who had learned how to stand. 15 years later, morning light spilled over the rows of red brick buildings where the city's child protection unit was headquartered. A police cruiser pulled up to the curb. The door opened, and a tall man in a long coat stepped out, his stride steady, his shoulders squared. The nameplate on his chest read, "Detective James Whitman, Child Protection Unit." With a sharp yet gentle gaze, James had become a living symbol of resilience. At his side walked his closest partner, Tommy Ricks, the boy who once teased him at school, now his most trusted ally in every investigation. That morning they entered a local children's shelter. A call had come in about a child suspected of being abused. James didn't just do the job, he lived it, heart first. In a small room, a 10-year-old girl sat trembling in the corner. Bruises marked her wrist. Her eyes, lost and wide, looked just like James's had, all those years ago. James sat down quietly, offering his hand. "I'm James," he said softly. "I'm here to listen. You don't have to say anything if you're not ready. Just know, you're not alone." The girl looked at him, lips tight, then, slowly, nodded. James knelt beside her and pulled a blank notebook from his coat pocket. "If you'd like, you can write it down. You don't have to hold it in anymore." She took the pen. Her hand still shook, but the first words began to appear. Behind them, Tommy stood silent, moved. He had once questioned why James chose this path. Now, he understood, James wasn't just a detective. He was the beginning of hope. That day, after completing their report, James and Tommy didn't return to the precinct. Instead, James turned down a familiar street, pulling into the old park, the place where he once hid from the rain, once buried a box beneath the roots of an old tree. By late afternoon, a soft breeze rustled the leaves overhead. James stepped beneath the tree, placing a small bouquet of wild flowers and a photo, his first day at the unit, in front of the roots. Then he sat on the nearby bench, eyes gazing into the amber sky. "You once said, 'If you don't see me again, look under this tree.' Well, you don't have to look anymore. I'm here. I'm alive, and I'm standing with other kids now, like you once stood with me." Behind him, Nathaniel arrived. He said nothing, simply placed a hand on James's shoulder. They sat together, as they had years ago. 2 lives, 1 memory, 1 present. In a televised interview, a host asked James, "Why did you choose to become a child protection officer rather than follow in your adoptive father's wealthy footsteps?" James paused. Then, looking straight into the camera, he answered, "Because I know what it feels like to be trapped in darkness. I know what it's like when every cry for help goes unheard. But I was listened to. I was believed. I was saved. By people like my dad, Nathaniel Grayson. By Matilda. By Detective Charles Morton. They didn't just rescue me. They showed me what humane justice looks like, and I want to be that person for someone else." James didn't hide his past. He honored it. At a university panel, James opened his laptop and projected an old image onto the screen, a wooden wall with words carved by a fingernail. "If you find this, please don't stay silent." He turned to the students and said, "You might be the first person to hear a cry for help. You may not save the whole world, but if each of us saves just 1 person, the world would already be different." The room erupted in applause. In the corner, Nathaniel, now graying, watched his son with quiet pride. Beside him, Charles Morton leaned over and whispered, "That boy, he became the very light he once searched for." James stepped down from the stage, shaking hands with young attendees. One boy, tearful, approached him. "I read about you. I was abused too. And I kept going because of that sentence, the one you carved in the chicken coop." James paused, then gripped the boy's hand firmly, eyes steady. "You don't have to stay silent anymore. And now, you can help other kids find their voices too. Stand beside them. Don't look away." On James's badge, beneath his name, there was a small inscription, engraved by request, "The one who hears silence." His life wasn't just a miracle, it was living proof that even in the darkest places, light can be found if someone chooses to listen. On a crisp autumn morning, the city awoke beneath soft rays of sunlight, casting golden hues over red brick rooftops and trees shedding their leaves. Across a quiet street, the wall clock inside the Office of Child Protection struck 7 a.m. Senior Inspector James Whitman sat in the meeting room, his desk stacked with unopened case files. Next to him, a steaming cup of coffee and a nameplate that read, "Senior Detective James Whitman, Division of Youth Protection, Central Region." He opened a new file gently. A 9-year-old boy, chronically absent from school, malnourished, eyes described as hollow, like something inside him had already died. The name, Elian Navarro. The boy didn't speak, didn't cry, didn't explain when brought to the social care center. But James understood, because once he had been Elian. And that's why, without hesitation, he took the case. After the morning briefing, James stepped out of the building into the crisp fall air. A breeze stirred the trees and brought with it the scent of damp earth and old memories. He walked to the shelter where Elian was staying. Inside a pale blue room, Elian sat curled in a chair, staring out the window with an empty gaze. James sat down beside him, not facing him. He didn't force eye contact. "Hi, Elian," he said quietly. "I'm James. I once went months without talking to anyone, but the first person who sat next to me without asking anything helped me survive. So if you don't want to say anything today, that's okay. We can just sit here." Elian turned, startled. 1 second, 2 seconds, then his eyes softened, just slightly. It wasn't trust yet, not even acceptance, but it was a beginning, a thread of healing. James began taking Elian on afternoon walks through the city park, the same place he once hid from the rain. They walked slowly, no destination, no pressure. James talked about the trees changing color, about a baby bird that had lost its mother but still learned how to fly, and about a boy named James who once lived in a chicken coop but still found a home. As the days passed, Elian began to ask small questions. "Were you scared? Why didn't you just run away?" James answered them all, honestly, without sugarcoating, because he believed children don't need lies to feel safe. They need truth, and someone strong enough to walk them through it. 1 year later, Elian stood as the student speaker at the city's public school opening ceremony. Wearing a crisp white shirt and a small tie, he held the microphone with both hands. Hundreds of students, teachers, and parents watched in silence. "I used to think no one heard me. I thought if I disappeared, no one would notice. But then, someone sat next to me. They didn't ask questions. They didn't speak. They just stayed. And because of that, I'm still here." He paused, then looked down at the front row where James was seated. A small smile crossed his face. "I've learned sometimes what we need most isn't someone to save us, but someone who won't leave when we're at our weakest." The crowd rose in applause. The room filled with warmth. James sat still, not overwhelmed but deeply aware. What he had once done quietly, instinctively, had become someone else's light. And now that light was passing from hand to hand. On International Children's Day, the city honored citizens for outstanding contributions to child protection. James was called to the stage. He gave no long speech, just one sentence, now etched in memory. "I used to be a child no one called by name. Now I'm here to call out the names of other children, to let them know they are seen, they are heard, they are alive." Afterward, a journalist approached James. "If you could go back to that day, when you were locked in the chicken coop, what would you say to your younger self?" James paused, then looked directly into the camera. "Don't be afraid. The light is coming, and one day you'll stand in that light to help light the way for someone else." Years passed. Nathaniel Grayson grew old. His hair turned silver, his walk slower, but his eyes still shone. At a ceremony where James was awarded an honorary doctorate in children's rights law, Nathaniel sat front row, his trembling hands clapping non-stop. James's thesis, building a proactive child protection system, from prevention to rapid response, was recognized as groundbreaking. In his acceptance speech, James didn't speak of pain. He spoke of gratitude. "I thank the man who pulled over on a rainy night because he saw a wet boy holding a book. I thank the librarian who kept my truth safe. I thank the pastor who believed in a speech from a child no one believed. And I thank my father who didn't ask questions but stayed beside me. Sometimes saving someone doesn't take power. It just takes staying." The crowd stood, applauding. Nathaniel wiped away tears. And in that moment, he knew his greatest legacy wasn't wealth. It was James. More years passed. A small statue was erected in the old park, under the very tree where James once sought shelter. It depicted a boy sitting at the tree's base, holding a book, looking up toward the sky. At the base of the statue, one sentence was etched in stone. If you find this, please don't stay silent. Hundreds attended the unveiling. Children, parents, teachers, lawyers, journalists, and police officers. They didn't come for fame. They came for James. For his quiet, steadfast presence, like a brother, a friend, someone who had once been there. A small child stepped forward and asked, "Who is that, Grandma?" An elderly woman, Matilda, now over 80, smiled gently. That's the first person who listened, when no one else could. James's story became required reading in law schools, social work programs, and training centers for child advocates. A new public school opened in the city's poorest district, James Whitman School for Resilience and Hope. Once, children there only dreamed of attending school. Now, they had books, they had classrooms, and they had names. On a quiet evening, James stood on the balcony of the penthouse where he first learned how to sleep under warm light. Nathaniel had passed away 3 years earlier, but his presence lived on. In a photo on the wall, in the wooden desk, James never replaced. The wind whispered through the trees. James opened an old notebook, the one he wrote in back in the chicken coop. The pages had yellowed. The childish handwriting made the grown man's eyes mist over. At the bottom of the last page, he added one final line, "Thank you for not staying silent." He closed the notebook and returned inside. On his desk, an open letter waited. It was from a boy named Kai, age 11. "I saw you on TV. My dad used to hit me too, but after hearing you speak, I told my teacher. Now I'm somewhere safe. Thank you. I hope I can grow up to be like you." James picked up the letter and smiled. His eyes turned to the night sky, lit by thousands of tiny city lights. Thank you to that one child who didn't give up hope. The wind blew gently, and the lights in the distance seemed to hum a familiar chorus. If you find this, please don't stay silent. And now, thousands had heard it. They were speaking, they were acting, and they were writing the next chapter in their own names. Thank you, wherever you are in this vast world, for listening to James's journey from darkness into light. Maybe you were once hurt. Maybe you're walking through uncertainty now. Or maybe you simply paused and chose to listen to a child once forgotten. Whoever you are, thank you for not staying silent. Because what James and every child in pain needs is not just pity, but someone willing to listen. Someone brave enough to believe. Someone willing to act. If this story stirred something in you, don't let it end as just a feeling. Be a small light for someone else. A hug, a question, "Are you okay today?" Or simply the willingness to sit beside someone in silence. Because if you hear this, please don't stay silent. And thank you, not just for hearing a story, but for carrying a piece of humanity forward.